11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. Guidance is internal.
My earliest memories are actually taking a tour here. Being from Claybank kid, and going to school there, the big thrill of the year was to be able to walk to the Claybank brick plant and take a tour. So when I was in about grade 2, we came here and we took a tour, and of course the plant was running, so we got to actually see the plant in action and the men, doing their things. I remember going up to one of the kilns that was in the cooling down process, but still quite hot, and they had a tube that you could look into. They would, they have a special instrument that they can check the heat in there, and we were allowed to crawl up on an apple box and peer into this hole to see what the brick was like. I never even gave a second thought to where those bricks would be going. It was just a little brick plant in the middle of nowhere. The brick that was made here being refractory, and by refractory one means that it's high heat brick. Steel will melt at about 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas our brick won't deteriorate until you hit about 3300 degrees. A lot of the old timers swear by it that some of our brick was used in the launch pads at Cape Canaveral for the Apollo moonshots in the 70s. A.P. Green at that time owned the brick plant, so it's very possible that he would have gathered together as much of his high-grade refractory brick in order to build those launch pads.
From our research to date, this brick plant at Claybank is the best preserved early 20th century brick plant of its kind in North America.
I remember quite clearly the first day we came out here, and what struck me was its location. The image of the site as you approach it, with the kilns and the stacks silhouetted against the hills, is really spectacular.
The native people used this clay, far before the brick plant was ever even thought of. They would allow the children to play in the puddles of water that were up in the clay, and they said that that clay would capture their laughter, and that made its power even greater. They still say if you go up into the clay pits and sit very quietly and listen, you can still hear the children's laughter that's still echoing in that clay.
Brick goes back thousands of years. I mean, the Egyptians and the people in Mesopotamia, they were making hand-molded bricks at that time. The concept of a stove kiln has been there for centuries and centuries, where you just put a huge pile of brick together and you burn it for a week or two and then see what you get. And if it isn't quite right, the next time you burn it for a couple of weeks longer.
In 1886, there was a man named Tom McWilliams, and he had lost some cows in the dirt hills here. He borrowed a telescope and took a look out here and saw that there were outcroppings of clay, like little white outcroppings. He knew he had something very special, and he took his clay and started peddling it to different brick plants in Moose Jaw. He'd come out here, he'd dig clay for a day and a half, and it would take him a day and a half to get back to Moose Jaw, and then he would sell it to different brick makers there. So it wasn't a real money-making proposition at that time. But he held on, he persevered, and then when the railway started coming through, 5 doctors and lawyers in Moose Jaw partnered with him, and they started building the brick plant actually in 1912.
Oh, probably when I was 6 or 7 years old. We used to come Saturday and Sunday and run around the plant here. There was hardly just a fireman working, so we could get away with snooping around.
As a teenager, I'd come up here and ride, and then we'd get off the bikes and climb the hills, and to see the old relics of the past. To me, it was the truly, a romantic place. It captured my imagination. So much history in you.
Everyone in my mom's family worked here at one time almost. I remember being amazed when you drove in to go see my grandparents, and you drive right by the big plant. I was amazed how big it was. It seemed gigantic then.
It dates from that sort of early industrial period, you know, where you had really very kind of evocative forms that you don't really see in industrial sites now, whereas some of the early industrial sites were in fact very beautiful. And here we see the chimneys and the downdraft kilns with their very distinctive domed roofs. So some of those things really, I think, inspired architects and really led to the development of modernist architecture in the mid-part of the century.
So this is a downdraft kiln, and it's circular, and it has a dome, an arched dome, and when it's built without mortar. That's deliberate because as the kiln heats up, it expands, and then when it contracts, as it cools down, so the bricks have to be able to move in and out. And there are large bands on the outside that they loosen and tighten to help the kiln move. And you can see here the bricks, they're loose, and they're all friction fit, as is the whole arch. So as long as the arch is intact, the arch is structurally secure. These domes, while they look like they may be fragile, in fact, they're quite strong.
When they first started the brick plant in 1912, they would dig out the clay by hand, bring it down on with mule and cart to the brick plant. They needed more clay, they had big orders, they could produce more. Then they laid a little narrow gauge railway line. The little engine would go up a trestle bridge and into the rafters of the clay shed and then dump its clay down from there. Once the engine couldn't bring enough clay to the site, in about 1943, they bought a larger truck.
When they actually mined the clay, to me that's kind of beyond imagination. It's when you walk through the hills or you take the tours up, it's intriguing.
The clay is stored in the clay shed, but it's in fairly large pieces. It would be taken down and dumped into a kind of a big grinder that was like, it was called a dry pan, and it had two great big maulers. When a brick was supposed to be made, you know, whether it was a face brick or whether it was a refractory brick, basically a recipe was taken out, and it was like so much grog would be dumped into a cart, and so much sandy and so much of this clay and so much of that clay until the recipe was right.
I worked on the dry pan, mostly wheeling clay to the dry pan all night, 9 hours, 36 cents an hour. Then I got promoted to the pug mill. It was closing down already. And next year I was working with the carpenter, and I was working with the blacksmith part-time. I built that porch that's on the bunkhouse. It's still there. I built a fence by Goodman's house. It's still there.
Oh, cool.
With a lot of paint on it, I'll tell you that.
The brick plant in its heyday had to have about 85 men working here. So the surrounding countryside couldn't provide that kind of manpower. So of course that attracted a lot of people to come in, and they couldn't find room and board, so they built this bunkhouse.
Yeah, I lived in the bunkhouse. I paid $1 a day for room and board. Yeah.
How was the food?
Food was pretty good. Tommy was very good. Tom Young, he was a very good man. He gave us real good food.
I looked around, it was getting colder, and I asked if I couldn't work in the mold shop where it was warm.
Because that was a good place to start working, because you got paid by piecework.
A unit was classified as an hour's work, and we did 11 hours work in about 60. You ran just like reindeer all day long and got to go home at 3 o'clock. Just about like with kids when they make mud pies, you know, it was a stiff mud, very stiff mud, eh? And you'd roll it into a ball like a baker makes a loaf of bread, eh? And you'd slam it into this mold and give it about 5 or 6 good whacks on a solid 2-inch plate. You'd cut the top off, the excess, and trowel it and tip it out, and then it would be supposed to be a perfect block or brick.
There's the AB press, which was the first press that came to the brick plant, and it pressed the first brick in 1912, pressed the last brick in 1989, and still presses brick today on Heritage Day. That's the actual one that we used.
I ran the press, the dry press, for a few years. Eh? We'd start and we'd stand in one spot and look at the same guy for 8 hours. It was a real boring job, very boring.
And then we have the X-Press. The X-Press was a newer press because it made rounded bricks, and it's the one that was very important to us because it made the brick that went into the Corvette and destroyer warships.
If you want a really big brick, and they do it 4 inches thick. When they closed down, they took this one out and they donated it back to us when they became a natural historical site.
Is this the one they brought from Ontario?
Yeah, they took it to Ontario, and they never, from what I've been told, they haven't even taken it out of the crate yet, and they brought it back to us.
Oh, yeah.
They were just going to junk it. I like all the old machinery, how it all ran, and you don't see this very much anymore.
Once the brick was actually made, it would either be put on a cart or set on a hot floor in order to dry for a few days before it went through the kiln process.
Before they actually fire the kiln, the two doors are closed and they're sealed up, and then the bricks are gradually heated, and there's a hole in the center of the ceiling where any excess moisture will be released. And so as they're gradually filling up the kiln with heat, any excess humidity, any moisture left in the brick that hasn't already come out has to escape through there. And once they've determined that that the brick is totally dry, then they turn the heat on full blast. So the heat, it goes up to the top of the dome, and then it's sucked down actually through the bricks because there's an air current system that goes through the flues in the floor and then up the smokestack. It takes about 5 days to fill up a kiln this size by hand. It's all manually done. It takes another 5 days to heat the kiln up to the temperature they want, 5 days to burn it, and 5 days to cool it, and another 5 days to empty it. So it's a slow process.
When they unloaded it, they didn't use the little carts. They actually used men with wheelbarrows, and they were called the wheelers.
I couldn't give up them. They were just fantastic workers. They'd work tons an hour they wheeled out of there. 500 pounds on a wheelbarrow, and away they go.
They gave me a load of brick to take to the car one time. I loaded the wheelbarrow, started going halfway as I tipped it, and the bus said, "Fred, you're too light. You go and do that other job."
In the wintertime, when it was 30 below, it didn't matter. If you had to go to the toilet, it was outdoor toilet. So coming from this hot environment down to up in the hill where the wind was blowing out was pretty tough.
Actually, my cousin used to work there, so he was hand molding, and he noticed that the men were putting up a fan type thing up on the ceiling, and he thought, oh, thank goodness, they're going to put a fan in, and it's going to move the air around in here, and it'll be a little bit cooler. So 3 days later, when they turned on that fan, it was actually heat coming down, because the quicker they could dry that brick, the quicker it could be on that train car and out to its destination, and the more money they could make. The almighty dollar definitely ran this brick plant, but then industry is like that, you know, and they didn't care much if they were going to melt the man.
Well, that was atrocious. Honest to God, it was really bad. In the grinding room, I couldn't have seen somebody 3 feet away from me. I even used to think it's really a dangerous place. Like, for one thing, the line shaft was controlled in the engine room, where all the belts were running off of it. And there was an accident. And I wasn't 15 feet away from the accident. The belt came off, and a man was killed. And I mentioned, I said, why isn't there a split in that line shaft that we could I could have shut it off in 30 seconds. And their reply, some of the men too, they said, well, everybody be shutting. I said, no, when we want to work, we don't come here to shut the plant down. You know. And they did that, and they did it. They took our recommendation.
The introduction of natural gas got rid of all the dirty coal. I mean, these guys were just filthy black from the coal dust. And the backbreaking work. I mean, a natural gas port, you just turn it on and there it is, you know, you've got your heat.
It was actually a fireman, so it's like a big barbecue in there. So you turn on the natural gas, and he was just going to light the match to throw it in the wicket from the outside, and someone down you know, a couple of 3 doors down, said, hey, Charlie, come over here, I gotta show you something. Of course, you know how men are, they like yak, yak, yak all the time, and 20 minutes later, this guy comes back. He lit this match and he stuck it in there. Of course, it blew up. The kiln roof went straight up and it came straight down, and it didn't fit real good when it came back down again. And of course, a lot of that pressure came out that wicket, and he lost his eyebrows, he lost his hearing for 3 days, and blew his glasses off to somewhere, and he just stood there paralyzed with this little match.
I have fond memories working there, very fond memories. I don't know what things would have been a lot different for me if I hadn't worked here, because I'd have probably been in Alberta or somewhere now. You know.
It was my first job in my lifetime. I made some money. After I went home, before I went home, I went to Moose Jaw. I bought a suit in there, and I paid $9 for a 3-piece suit. And it was a very good suit, not just what you buy now for $9.
The biggest market, I think, would have been the locomotive fireboxes. Once the diesel train engines came into being, that took a huge market away from the brick plant.
In other factories, brick plants, they've installed what are called tunnel kilns, just a straight, long tunnel that may be several hundred feet long. That starts off with the wet brick, or green brick as it's called, at one end. It's gradually dried, then it's fired, and it's gradually cooled, and it comes out at the other end, all ready burnt and ready to go to market. That process takes 2 days. Here it takes 5 weeks. A.P.
Green was a multinational. He owned the brick plant for its last 30 years of existence. He basically kept the brick plant so that he could have a foothold in Canada and transport some of his product over the borders. And once free trade came in, of course, then he no longer needed that foothold in Canada. So they looked at the plant. They said either we raise all the kilns and put in a tunnel kiln system, or we close it down. And they decided to close it down, which is the silver lining of that event, because had they raised the plant, we wouldn't have it.
It was really a local group, mainly headed by Frank Korvermaker, which eventually resulted in its designation as provincial heritage property and also as a National Historic Site.
Sat here till about 1993, when Frank Korvermaker spied it on one of his trips around Saskatchewan. So he came down and took some video of it and took it back to the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation in Regina, and said that they should, try and get this place designated before it was razed to the ground.
Brickwork, the back part of this building, there's some brick that's come loose, same with the carpenter shop.
They brought it to the attention of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, and Andre Lalonde was the representative for Saskatchewan at that time on that board, and they just happened to be meeting in Saskatchewan. So he talked the board into boarding a bus and coming to see the site.
I'm going to get this machine working.
So of course, the wind is born at Claybank, the legend goes, and it was a horrendously windy day when the board came. And the Historical Society, that was just in infancy at that time, had made Saskatoon berry pie and served it in the kiln for the board. They always said that it was the Saskatoon pie that clinched it for them, and then they decided to designate it as a National Historic Site.
Of course, as the years progressed, without any heat, they obviously deteriorated in a fairly rapid manner, and now it rains outside and it rains for 2 more days inside. It's just like a sod roof. Right, yeah. And then, of course, our water problem, too. Is that floor going down again? Not so much the floor. It's the corner of the buildings now. You can still see gaps, and bricks are falling down, and there's no mortar in between anymore. It's been eaten out. What about the lab? Is it continuing to deteriorate? It's even worse, yeah. It's like you can walk through some of the holes now. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's definitely worse than it was 2 years ago. And then a big wind came and ripped the tin roof off the little lean-to there. Yeah. Yeah. But other than that, it's good shape. When the whole plant was shut down, all of a sudden those kilns, which were generating several thousand degrees of heat, were shut off, and all of the land underneath the site was then starting to absorb water. You get down here, and the brick is completely just turned into a white powder. And of course, when that's happening at the base of your structure, you have a major problem trying to preserve the rest of the building. But let's go around the outside first so I can show you where this big hole is. There's a huge hole in the wall itself. where all of the brick has deteriorated. So this is the lab, and this is the place where they did a lot of their testing of the various clays and the kind of brick products they could have. There's a pressure unit here that they could put a brick in, and then this would come down, and there's a gauge here that would enable them to know how much pressure they could put on the brick before it would crack. So all the new products were tested here. There's a variety of chemical equipment. And then there's a little mini kiln inside here where they would burn these bricks. So they could do a single brick or several bricks. The alkali is even attacking the test kiln here from down below. So none of this, there's nothing that's sacred here. But it's not as bad as the wall, but it certainly is, you know, the mortar that's out here just crumbles.
So what to do? And we commissioned a study, and they sketched out several options, one of which was the installation of what is called the American wick drain.
Just drill a hole in the ground?
Yeah, they kind of punch it into the ground, and there's a wick. The basic component is a wick that draws water up, and then the water simply evaporates into the air. So it's just quite costly. It could be well in excess of $100,000. Danny suggested at a meeting earlier this year that, you know, based on his farming experience, a possible solution might be to simply plant alfalfa.
Like alfalfa will go down 24 feet.
Okay.
The taproot, so.
To reseed it every year?
No.
Is it seeded?
No.
Oh, that's nice.
It should be good for years and years and years.
So if the alfalfa, which gets tap roots of 15, 20, 25 feet, will suck out the water table and make it evaporate through its plant system, hopefully that will drop the water table to a point when it's no longer attacking the foundations of the buildings. It's a gamble, but it's a cheap gamble. We have nothing to lose.
You'll see some of the kilns here, for example. These are at the north end of the grouping of the kilns, and they're in relatively good condition. But if you go to the south end, which of course is also closer to the hills and closer to where the water problems are, you'll see some deterioration happening there. And I can envision that those kilns will continue to show the effects of that over time. And I think that's okay. You know, you'll still have the traces of them there. But I think it's unrealistic and maybe undesirable to see the site as something that's going to be entirely pristine and completely restored.
You know, we are very much concerned about this site, you know, the safety of the site. The plant is totally flammable. It'll go up. I mean, the kilns won't, but the plant will. And so we get a grass fire here, that plant's gone. And without the plant, it's an interesting place to go to, but it's no longer the key place for this industrial heritage.
So they take the clay, and by getting different kinds of clay, that's how you get the different colors in the bricks. I think it's also how long it fires. That gives you a little bit of a different result too.
Claybank brick are very unique in that their colors were all different. If you built a brick house and it was a tan color and you wanted to add a porch on in 10 years and you came to us and said, we want exactly this color, it was very difficult to mimic that because they couldn't control the impurities in the coal or the clay. They could hardly control the temperature. But architects love our brick because they can make wonderful patterns.
Here are two of the most popular types of brick that came out of the site here. This one's called Rough Tex, and of course is distinguished by the score marks and the texture. And this was called TP Mocha, and has this wonderful sort of soft orangey brown color. And here you can really distinctly see the iron spot.
We're actually collecting bricks from anywhere in North America and bringing them here. We want to start a North American brick collection. We want to get examples of bricks made here, but we also want to get examples of bricks made at Estevan Brick and Bruno Brick. And there were about 100 brick plants in Saskatchewan at one time. Where there are bricks that we can't actually bring here, people don't want to part with their favorite bricks. I mean, these are collectors after all. If they'll scan in the brick, we can take the image and then use that on the virtual collection.
We just sent some brick down to the Cathedral of Gravelburg. They were doing a bit of a renovation and they needed, you know, some bricks. So they come down here and they have a look and we match them up as best we can. And it's a good thing. It helps historic buildings stay viable, and it also helps for people to see that our brick is out there and all these different wonderful buildings that the brick was used for.
Well, I think the major challenge for this site is to really continue to evolve the presentation of the site and interpretation of it as a tourism site. Try to connect that with an economic strategy for the area.
I really enjoy it. The people are really interested in what you have to say, and a lot of them just can't believe how it all worked. Like, it looks old, and they can't believe how it actually went till '89 with the equipment still in it from when they opened.
They were well-built machines, those old things. They just keep going and going and going.
You look at it, it looks almost like ancient, almost like pyramids out there. I'm really impressed with just the infrastructure and all the machinery, the how it works. It's so complicated, and yet at the end of the process, we get something so simple, but it's so functional and helpful to building the province.
This is one of the most unusual historic sites you'll see. There are lots of fur trade posts and military posts and houses and the like around North America, but you'll not find another brick plant like this, certainly not of this caliber. It is virtually intact, and it's late 19th century technology being used right throughout the 20th century.
We are basically a $6 million project, and we're about $2 million into that $6 million project. So we've got a little ways to go, but we persevere, and little by little, we'll manage to save it.
I would like this place to be kept so that maybe my children and grandchildren will come and see it someday in here.
We have it all here. It was ours for the taking. Now we have a task to preserve it, but at least we have it. It's not a pile of rubble and a memory.